The parking lot was emptying out, but not in the usual way. Every Sunday for 15 years, Jennifer had pulled into spot B7 at First Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama. Her grandfather had helped pour the foundation. Her wedding photos lined the fellowship hall. But on this particular Sunday in 2019, as she sat in her car watching families stream toward the entrance, her hands wouldn't turn the key. She just couldn't do it anymore. She drove home, changed out of her Sunday dress, and cried for 3 hours. Jennifer had become something sociologists never expected to see in significant numbers in the American South. A church refugee? Now here's what makes this story remarkable. Jennifer wasn't fleeing because of a scandal. No pastor had embezzled funds. No one had hurt her. She simply couldn't reconcile what she was hearing from the pulpit with what she was reading in her Bible. And she's not alone. Right now, across the Bible Belt, something unprecedented is happening. In the very region where church attendance has been as American as sweet tea in college football, thousands are walking away, but they're not walking away from faith. They're walking away from the institution, and the numbers are staggering. Between 2019 and 2022, the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in America, lost over 2 million members. 2 million. That's the equivalent of every person in Houston, Texas, just vanishing from the pews. In Alabama, church attendance has dropped 43% since 2000. In Mississippi, the most religious state in America, weekly attendance fell from 63% to 47% in just a decade. Something is breaking. But before we go further, welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shape our world. If you're finding value in this deep dive into one of the most significant cultural shifts in American history, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us continue bringing you these detailed investigations. Now, I'm curious, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. Are you watching this from the very Bible Belt we're discussing, or from somewhere else entirely? Let me take you back to understand why this is so shocking. The Bible Belt isn't just a metaphor. It's a real geographical and cultural phenomenon that stretches from Virginia down through the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and parts of Texas and Oklahoma. The term was coined in 1924 by H.L. Mencken, the Baltimore journalist who was covering the Scopes monkey trial. But the reality it describes goes back much further. After the Civil War, evangelical Christianity became the cultural glue of the South. It wasn't just religion, it was identity. In 1906, there were more churches per capita in the South than anywhere else in the world. By 1980, 72% of Southerners attended church at least once a week. To not be in church on Sunday wasn't just unusual, it was suspicious. Job interviews happened in church parking lots. Business deals were sealed with handshakes in Sunday school classrooms. If you wanted to run for local office, you needed a church. Period. My own research uncovered a fascinating detail. In Gadsden, Alabama, in 1955, the Chamber of Commerce published a guide for newcomers. It listed 37 churches before it mentioned a single school, hospital, or store. The message was clear: church first, everything else second. So what happened? How did we get from that world to Jennifer sitting in her car, unable to walk through those familiar doors? The exodus didn't happen overnight. It's been building for decades, but it accelerated dramatically after 2016. And here's where the story gets complicated because the reasons are as diverse as the people leaving, but they share common threads. Meet Marcus. He's a 42-year-old insurance adjuster from Nashville. Grew up in the Assembly of God. Attended 5 services a week as a kid. Vacation Bible school. Youth group. Mission trips to Honduras. He was the model church kid. In 2020, Marcus stopped going. When I spoke with him for this investigation, he told me something I heard, repeated in dozens of interviews. I didn't leave Jesus. I left the circus. What Marcus meant was this. He'd watched his church become increasingly political, not in a general sense. Specific, partisan. He described a sermon in October 2020 where his pastor spent 40 minutes explaining why voting for a particular political party was the only biblical choice. Marcus is politically conservative. That wasn't his issue. His issue was that the gospel he'd been taught, the one about loving enemies and caring for the poor, seemed to have been replaced by something else entirely. Something that felt more like nationalism wrapped in religious language. The data backs up Marcus's experience. A 2021 study by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 68% of white evangelical Southerners believed their pastors should speak out on political issues. But here's the twist. When they did, it often drove people away. Not because they disagreed with the politics, but because the message had changed. For Marcus and thousands like him, church had become a place where they were told who to vote for, but not how to love their neighbors. Then there's Sarah, a 37-year-old high school teacher from Birmingham. Her story is different, but equally telling. Sarah left her megachurch after what she calls the worship concert era. She described services that felt more like rock concerts than reverent gatherings. "We had a fog machine," she told me. A fog machine in church. And the pastor wore skinny jeans and quoted more from Marvel movies than from scripture. Now, you might think this is just generational preference. Older folks uncomfortable with a contemporary worship, but Sarah is a millennial. She grew up with contemporary Christian music. She's not opposed to guitars or drums. What bothered her was what she saw as a fundamental shift from substance to spectacle. Everything became about the experience, she said. About feelings, about being entertained. But nobody actually read the Bible anymore. We'd sing about God for 30 minutes, then hear a 20-minute TED Talk about success. I could get that on YouTube. The megachurch phenomenon is crucial to understanding this exodus. In 1970, there were 10 megachurches in America. By 2010, there were 600, many of them in the Bible Belt. These weren't traditional Southern churches. They were massive operations with coffee shops, bookstores, and ATMs in the lobby. They promised community but often delivered anonymity. You could attend for years without anyone knowing your name. Dr. Ryan Burge, a political scientist and pastor who has studied this trend extensively, found something remarkable. The average megachurch attendee in the South stays for only 18 months. 18 months. People are church shopping, constantly searching for the right fit, the right experience. And increasingly, they're giving up the search altogether. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. These church refugees aren't becoming atheists. In fact, most of them still identify as Christians. They still pray. They still read their Bibles. They're just doing it at home or in coffee shops or in small gatherings in living rooms. They've left the institution but kept the faith. This has created something entirely new in the Bible Belt, a massive population of unchurched believers. The Barna Group's research from 2023 shows that 38% of adults in the South now identify as Christian but don't attend church. In 1990, that number was 6%. Let me tell you about something happening in Atlanta that perfectly illustrates this shift. There's a group of about 40 people, mostly in their 30s and 40s, who meet every Sunday morning at a different coffee shop. They call themselves The Gathering, though they resist any official name or structure. They read scripture together, pray, take communion with store-bought bread and grape juice, and then spend the afternoon doing service projects, feeding the homeless, cleaning up neighborhoods, visiting nursing homes. I asked David, one of the organizers, why they don't just join a church. His answer was illuminating. We tried. We went to 15 different churches over 2 years. Some were too political. Some were too entertainment-focused. Some preached prosperity gospel. Some made us feel guilty for not titling enough. We just wanted to follow Jesus without all the baggage, so we started this. The Gathering isn't unique. Across the Bible Belt, these informal groups are multiplying. They're rejecting denominational structures, professional clergy, and church buildings. They're rediscovering what they see as a more primitive, authentic form of Christianity, and they're doing it completely outside the traditional church system. This brings us to another crucial factor in the Exodus, the clergy abuse scandals. For years, survivors had been speaking out, but 2019 marked a turning point. That February, the Houston Chronicle published an investigation revealing that over 700 victims had been abused by Southern Baptist pastors and church workers over a 20-year period. 700. And these were just the documented cases. The report detailed how churches had protected abusers, moved them from congregation to congregation, and silenced victims. The institutional response was, in many cases, to deny, deflect, and defend. For people like Rachel, a survivor from Little Rock, it was the final straw. I reported what happened to me to 3 different church leaders, she told me. All 3 told me to forgive and move on. One suggested I'd misunderstood the situation. I was 14 when it happened. There was no misunderstanding. I left and never went back. The abuse scandals didn't just affect survivors. They shattered the trust of thousands who had believed their churches were safe havens. Parents who had trusted youth pastors, weaves who had trusted counselors, communities that had trusted institutions. When that trust broke, many people couldn't rebuild it. Then there's the intellectual crisis, and this might be the most underreported aspect of the church refugee phenomenon. Meet Jason, a software engineer from Austin. Jason grew up in a strict fundamentalist church that taught young earth creationism and biblical literalism. When he went to college and studied geology, he encountered evidence he couldn't ignore. The earth was old. Evolution had occurred. These weren't matters of faith, but of observable fact. Jason went to his pastor with questions. He wasn't trying to challenge anyone. He genuinely wanted to understand how to reconcile his faith with what he was learning. The pastor's response was blunt. You can believe the Bible or believe science, but you can't believe both. Jason tried to believe both. For years, he lived with cognitive dissonance. Eventually, the strain became too much. He didn't leave Christianity, but he left his church. And he found that outside the institutional church, there was room for faith and reason to coexist. The data on this is striking. A 2022 Pew Research study found that among church refugees under 40, 63% cited the church's stance on science, particularly evolution and climate change, as a factor in their departure. They weren't rejecting faith. They were rejecting what they saw as anti-intellectualism masquerading as faithfulness. Now, what about money? Because we can't discuss the church refugee movement without talking about finances. The prosperity gospel took root in the Bible Belt in the 1980s and exploded in the 2000s. Preachers promised that faithful giving would result in material blessing. Sow a seed, they'd say, and watch God multiply it back to you. For some, this message was liberating. For others, it became exploitative. Linda, a retired nurse from Jackson, Mississippi, told me she gave $60,000 to her church over 5 years because the pastor promised it would cure her husband's cancer. He died anyway. The pastor bought a private jet. I don't begrudge prosperity, Linda said, but when you're using God to manipulate poor people into funding your lifestyle, that's not Christianity. That's a con. The financial transparency issue extends beyond prosperity gospel churches. Many traditional churches refuse to publish detailed budgets. Megachurches often operate as complex financial entities with real estate holdings, media divisions, and for-profit subsidiaries. When members ask where the money goes, they're often told to trust leadership. But trust, as we've seen, is in short supply. Here's a question for you watching. What's your profession? Are you in ministry, healthcare, tech, education? I ask because the church refugee phenomenon cuts across all professional and socioeconomic lines. These aren't just young people or intellectuals or liberals. They're grandmothers and contractors and teachers and accountants. The exodus is universal. Let's talk about the COVID-19 pandemic because it acted as an accelerant. When churches closed in March 2020, something unexpected happened. Many people discovered they didn't miss it. They had more time with their families, they could worship at home, they could attend online services from churches across the country, sampling different teaching styles and theological perspectives. But more significantly, when churches reopened, many congregations split over masks, vaccines, and government authority. I spoke with Thomas, a deacon from a church in rural Georgia. He described meetings that devolved into shouting matches. Families that had worshiped together for generations stopped speaking. The church eventually split, with about half the congregation leaving to form a new church. Thomas left entirely. If we can't show basic kindness and patience with each other over masks, he said, how can we claim to follow Jesus? I decided I'd rather worship alone than participate in that madness. The pandemic revealed fault lines that had been forming for years. Political divisions, theological differences, generational gaps. When the pressure increased, the fractures became breaks. But let's zoom out for a moment and look at the broader cultural context. The Bible Belt is changing demographically. The 2020 census showed that the South is more diverse than ever. Cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, and Nashville are growing rapidly with transplants from other regions. These newcomers often bring different religious traditions or no religious tradition at all. The cultural monopoly that evangelical Christianity held for over a century is weakening. At the same time, younger generations are simply less religious. Gen Z attends church at half the rate of baby boomers. When they do attend, they're less likely to commit long-term. The idea of denominational loyalty, where you were born Baptist and died Baptist, is nearly extinct. Yet here's the paradox. While institutional religion is declining, spiritual interest remains high. Meditation apps are booming. Yoga studios are everywhere. People are reading philosophy and exploring Eastern religions. The human hunger for meaning, for connection, for transcendence hasn't disappeared. It's just finding new channels. Some church refugees are creating those new channels. I visited a group in Memphis that meets in a brewery. They call it Theology on Tap. About 30 people gather weekly to discuss spiritual texts, not just Christian, but from various traditions. They pray together. They serve their community together. But they explicitly reject being called a church. We're a community of seekers, one member told me. We're not trying to replace church. We're trying to find something more authentic. This raises a critical question. Is this exodus reversible? Are there churches successfully retaining and attracting people in the Bible Belt? The answer is yes, but they're rare, and they share common characteristics. They're typically smaller, more transparent, less political, and more focused on service than spectacle. I visited one in Asheville, North Carolina, that publishes its complete budget online. The pastor makes $45,000 a year, which is publicly disclosed. 70% of the church's budget goes directly to community service and international missions. They have no media ministry, no coffee shop, no bookstore. Just people trying to follow Jesus together. This church is growing, but slowly. They add maybe 20 to 30 members a year through word of mouth. They're not trying to be a mega church, they're trying to be a faithful community. And for many church refugees, that's exactly what they're looking for. The ripple effects of this exodus are significant. Churches are closing at unprecedented rates across the Bible Belt. In Alabama alone, over 200 churches closed permanently between 2019 and 2023. These aren't just buildings, they're community centers, historical landmarks, and social networks. When they close, communities lose gathering spaces and support systems. The economic impact is real too. Churches don't pay property taxes, which has been justified by their community benefit. But as they close, that lost tax revenue becomes more visible. Some cities are struggling with what to do with abandoned church buildings. Converting them to other uses is expensive and complicated. There's also a political dimension. For decades, churches in the Bible Belt have been reliable voting blocks and organizing centers for conservative politics. As church attendance declines, that organizational infrastructure weakens. We're already seeing this in places like Georgia and North Carolina, where political landscapes are shifting in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. But perhaps the most profound impact is on individual identity. For generations of Southerners, being Christian and being churched were synonymous. Your church was your community, your social circle, your support network. Leaving meant not just losing your religion, but losing your people. Church refugees often describe feeling isolated, even when they maintain their faith. They're caught between two worlds, too religious for their secular friends, too unchurched for their religious ones. Yet many also describe a sense of liberation, freedom from obligation, freedom from performance, freedom from the pressure to conform to someone else's interpretation of faith. They talk about rediscovering joy in their spirituality, about prayer feeling authentic again, about reading scripture without the lens of institutional interpretation. This movement is still evolving. We're watching in real time as one of America's most stable religious landscapes undergoes radical transformation. The Bible Belt as we've known it for over a century is disappearing. What's replacing it isn't clear yet. Some predict a more diverse religious landscape, with smaller, more authentic communities replacing megachurches. Others see continued secularization, with the South eventually resembling the Pacific Northwest in its religious demographics. Still, others believe this is a necessary purging, that the church is shedding cultural Christianity to reveal a more committed core. What's clear is that the church refugees aren't going back. Most of the people I interviewed for this investigation have been out of church for 3 to 8 years. They've built new lives, new communities, new spiritual practices. The bridges aren't just burned, they're collapsed. The institutional church would need to undergo fundamental transformation to win them back. And there's little evidence that's happening. Instead, many churches are doubling down, getting more political, more entertainment-focused, more insular. They're catering to the people who remain rather than asking why people are leaving. This might sustain them short-term, but the demographics are unforgiving. Every year, the Bible Belt loses thousands of committed church members to death. They're being replaced by younger people who never developed the church habit in the first place. So where does this leave us? Standing in a parking lot, watching the cars pull away, wondering what comes next. The American religious landscape is being redrawn. The Bible Belt, that solid, predictable band of evangelical Christianity, is fraying at the edges and thinning in the middle. But maybe that's not entirely tragic. Maybe Jennifer, sitting in her car that Sunday morning, wasn't witnessing an ending but a beginning. Maybe Marcus and Sarah and Rachel and Jason and Linda and Thomas and thousands of others are pioneers, not refugees. Maybe they're discovering that faith doesn't require an institution, that spirituality doesn't need a building, that following Jesus might actually be possible outside the structures that claimed to represent him. The movement continues. Every Sunday, more parking spots remain empty. More bulletins go unprinted. More pews sit vacant. The church refugees are out there scattered across the Bible Belt, creating something new in coffee shops and living rooms and brewery back rooms. They're reading their Bibles, they're praying, they're serving, they're seeking, they're just doing it without the church. And that's the movement the Bible Belt never saw coming. Not apostasy, not atheism, not even apathy, but a mass exodus of believers who loved God enough to leave the church that claimed to speak for him. History will judge whether they were running from something or running toward something. But either way, they're running, and they're not looking back.